My parents abandoned me with my grandfather when I was 8 months old. For 30 years, he was the only family I had. When he died, he left his estate to me. My parents, the same people who abandoned me as a baby, sued me for it. Then the judge froze over the file and asked they sued you. Before I tell you how a $12 million inheritance destroyed a councilman's career, let me know where you are watching from below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The mahogany doors of the attorney's conference room swung open with a heavy thud. Desmond, my father, and the esteemed city councilman of Atlanta marched in wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. My mother, Vivian, followed closely behind him, dripping in pearls and adjusting her designer jacket. She had perfected the grieving daughter routine for the cameras, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. My older sister Lauren walked in next, clutching the arm of her white husband Trevor. Trevor was a wealth manager who always looked at me like I was a stain on his expensive Italian leather shoes. They took their seats at the grand table, completely ignoring my presence in the corner chair. I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap. I was 30 years old and a forensic accountant, a profession that taught me the value of patience and observation. The attorney cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. He looked at the family that had just arrived, then gave me a brief, sympathetic nod. Elijah had been a quiet man, but he built a real estate empire from the ground up. He owned commercial properties across the city, places that generated quiet, steady wealth. Desmond leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, ready to accept what he believed was rightfully his, to fund his next political campaign. The attorney opened the thick manila folder and began reading the final testament of my grandfather. He listed a few small charitable donations, a trust for the church, and then he reached the primary assets. I leave my entire estate, including all commercial properties, investment portfolios, and liquid assets totaling $12 million solely and exclusively to my granddaughter Carmen. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Then the explosion happened. Vivian slammed her hands flat against the mahogany table, her pearls rattling against the wood. "That is a fake!" she screamed, her carefully constructed high society persona shattering instantly. He would never leave everything to her. My father, Desmond, stood up, his face flushed with a dark, furious red. He pointed a shaking finger at the attorney, demanding to see the signatures, claiming it was a mistake. Lauren whipped her head around and glared at me with pure hatred. "You manipulated him," Lauren yelled across the room. "You are a forensic accountant. You slithered your way into his finances and tricked him into signing away our family money. You have always been a jealous little rat trying to steal what belongs to us." I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I slowly stood up from my corner chair and walked toward the table, meeting Lauren's furious gaze with absolute calm. "The attorney is sitting right here, Vivian," I said smoothly. "And Lauren, do not call him your grandfather. You never visited him unless you needed a check." My voice dropped an octave, cutting through their shouting like a knife. 30 years ago, on the night Desmond announced his first run for city council, you realized a crying 8-month-old baby did not fit your perfect political image, so you wrapped me in a thin blanket and left me on Elijah's freezing porch in the middle of winter with a sticky note pinned to my chest. He was the only person who took me in. He was the only family I actually had. Desmond opened his mouth to shout, but Trevor placed a restraining hand on his father-in-law's shoulder. Trevor stepped forward, flashing a condescending smile that he reserved for people he considered beneath him. He reached into his tailored breast pocket, pulled out a checkbook, and quickly scribbled a number. He tore the check out and tossed it across the table. It landed right in front of me. $50,000. "Listen to me carefully," Carmen Trevor said, his tone dripping with white savior arrogance. "You live in a cheap apartment and you crunch numbers in a cubicle for a living. You have absolutely no idea how to manage $12 million in commercial real estate. You will bankrupt yourself in a year with the property taxes alone. My firm manages the real wealth for this family. Sign away your rights to the estate today. Take this pocket money to pay off your little student loans, and I will be generous enough to set up a small trust fund so you can survive." I looked down at the piece of paper resting on the polished wood. Trevor smirked, expecting me to snatch it up like a desperate beggar. My parents watched eagerly, holding their collective breath and assuming their wealthy son-in-law had just solved their massive financial problem with absolute ease. I picked up the check, holding it by the very edge. "You think $50,000 buys my silence, Trevor?" I asked quietly while maintaining direct eye contact. I tore the check directly down the middle, then placed the pieces back on the table. "Keep your pocket money to yourself. I have a dozen commercial properties to manage now." I turned my back on their stunned faces and walked out the door. The moment I stepped onto the sidewalk outside, my phone buzzed with an urgent alert. My primary credit card had just been unexpectedly declined for a simple $3 parking fee. I stared at the glowing screen of the parking kiosk. Declined. The red letters blinked back at me in the dim light of the underground garage. I pulled out my backup credit card, swiped it, and waited. Declined. My pulse remained steady, but a cold realization began to settle in my stomach. As a forensic accountant, I tracked sudden financial anomalies for a living. I knew exactly what a synchronized multi-account freeze looked like. It was not a bank error. It was a targeted strike. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and dialed the private number for my bank representative. The line rang twice before a nervous-sounding associate answered. I gave her my security PIN and asked for an explanation. There was a long pause filled with the clicking of a keyboard. "Ma, I am so sorry," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Your accounts have been locked by an emergency judicial order. We received the directive less than an hour ago. All personal and business assets associated with your social security number are currently frozen pending a probate investigation." I ended the call without arguing. Arguing with a bank teller was useless. I opened the legal database app on my phone and typed in my own name. The search results populated instantly, and the title of the newest filing made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. It was an emergency ex parte motion filed by my father, Councilman Desmond. The grounds for the freeze were listed in bold black letters: suspected elder abuse and financial coercion. I read through the preliminary brief, my eyes scanning the carefully constructed lies. Desmond claimed that I had used my expertise in forensic accounting to isolate a vulnerable senior citizen suffering from cognitive decline. He painted a picture of a predatory granddaughter who had manipulated an 85-year-old man into signing away his lifelong real estate empire. The audacity of the accusation was breathtaking. Desmond was a man who had not visited his own father in the hospital during his final weeks. He had sent a junior campaign staffer to drop off a generic fruit basket while he attended lavish fundraising dinners. Now, he was leveraging his political connections to bypass standard waiting periods, finding a sympathetic local judge to grant an immediate freeze on my entire life. The legal maneuver was brilliant in its cruelty. By crying elder abuse, Desmond was not just trying to invalidate the $12 million will. He was actively trying to destroy my professional reputation. If a forensic accountant is formally investigated for financial exploitation, their career is over. My license would be suspended. My clients would flee in panic. He wanted to strip me of the inheritance, but he also wanted to ensure I could never make a living in my chosen field again. He wanted me completely dependent, broken, and crawling back to the family for mercy. I sat in the quiet of my car and took a deep breath. Panic was exactly what they expected. They wanted me to call them crying. They wanted me to beg. Vivian would probably answer the phone with fake sympathy, telling me that family could fix this if I just cooperated. Trevor would offer me that $50,000 check again, pretending he was doing me a favor. They thought my lack of liquid cash would force my hand within days. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the garage. I needed to get back to my apartment. My home office was my sanctuary. I had backup drives, encrypted files, and hard copies of my grandfather's financial records that predated his passing. Elijah had known his son was greedy, but even he had not anticipated the sheer speed of Desmond's political weaponization. I needed to build a timeline of my grandfather's absolute mental clarity during the drafting of the will. I needed to gather my defense. The drive across Atlanta felt longer than usual. My mind raced through different legal strategies, categorizing assets and calculating how long I could survive on the minimal cash I had in my physical wallet. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, a modest but secure building where I had lived for the past 4 years. I just needed to get to my desk. As I walked toward the front entrance, I saw the property manager, a usually cheerful woman named Sarah, standing by the mailboxes. She was holding a clipboard and looking incredibly uncomfortable. When she saw me approach, she did not offer her usual warm greeting. She stepped forward, blocking my path to the elevators. "Carmen, I am so sorry," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. She held out a manila envelope. "I was told I had to serve this to you personally the moment you arrived." I took the envelope, feeling the heavy weight of the thick paper inside. "What is this, Sarah?" "The building was sold this morning," she explained, refusing to meet my eyes. "The new ownership group is clearing out several units for immediate luxury renovations. They are exercising the buyout clause in your lease. You have a 24-hour notice of eviction. You have to be out by tomorrow afternoon, or they will call the sheriff to forcibly remove your belongings." I ripped open the envelope and pulled out the legal notice. The eviction was typed in stark, aggressive language, demanding immediate vacation of the premises. But my eyes bypassed the threats and went straight to the top of the letterhead. I looked at the corporate logo of the new landlord. It was a holding company, a generic-sounding limited liability corporation. But I did not need to run a deep background check to know who was behind it. I recognized the registered agent address printed in the fine print at the bottom of the page. It was the exact same address as Trevor S. Wealth Management Firm. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. The courtroom ambush, the frozen bank accounts, and now the immediate eviction. It was a highly coordinated, simultaneous strike. Trevor had not just tossed that check at me out of arrogance. He had already set the trap. They had bought my building out from under me to render me homeless on the exact same day they rendered me penniless. They were cutting off every avenue of survival to force me into signing away my grandfather's $12 million legacy. I stared at the red letters on the kiosk screen. A simple $3 parking fee was standing between me and the exit, and my primary debit card, linked to an account with a very healthy balance, was suddenly useless. I pulled a backup credit card from a completely different bank out of my wallet. The machine chewed on it for a moment before spitting out the exact same rejection. My pulse remained steady. Panic is a luxury forensic accountants simply cannot afford. I put the car in park and opened the banking application on my phone. A bright red banner stretched across the top of my screen, informing me that all assets associated with my Social Security number had been frozen by a direct court order. I tapped the Details tab and read the summary. The legal filing attached to the freeze bore the seal of a local judge known to be in Desmond's pocket. The grounds for the emergency injunction were listed clearly: suspected elder abuse and financial manipulation. Desmond had wasted absolutely no time. He had used his political leverage as a city councilman to bypass standard legal procedures, painting me as a predator who had somehow tricked an 85-year-old man with a brilliant business mind into signing away his entire life's work. I dug a crumpled $5 bill out of my center console, fed it into the machine, and drove out of the garage. The drive back to my apartment gave me ample time to process the sheer audacity of my father's strategy. By accusing me of elder abuse, he was not just trying to block the inheritance. He was aiming a loaded weapon directly at my career. In the financial sector, an accusation of exploiting a vulnerable senior citizen is an absolute death sentence. My license would be revoked. My clients would vanish overnight. He wanted to strip away my grandfather's legacy and burn my own livelihood to the ground, leaving me with no choice but to crawl back to the family and beg for Trevor's $50,000 check. But Desmond fundamentally misunderstood the daughter he had abandoned 30 years ago. I did not break under pressure. I analyzed it. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, a quiet and secure building that had been my home for the last 4 years. I just needed a hot shower and my primary laptop to start building my defense. I walked up to the glass front doors and swiped my electronic key fob. A red light flashed. Access denied. I tried again, pressing the plastic firmly against the scanner. Another red light blinked back at me. Through the glass doors, I saw the property manager, a usually cheerful woman named Sarah, pacing nervously in the lobby. She looked up, saw me standing outside, and her face went completely pale. She unlocked the door manually and stepped outside, refusing to meet my eyes. She was clutching a thick manila envelope tightly against her chest. "I am so sorry," Carmen Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was instructed to hand this to you personally the moment you arrived." I took the envelope, the heavy paper feeling like lead in my hands. "What is this, Sarah?" I asked quietly. Sarah took a step back, wrapping her arms around herself. "The building was sold this morning to a new wealth management firm." She explained, her words rushing out in a panicked breath. "They are clearing several units immediately for luxury renovations. They invoked the emergency buyout clause in your lease. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises, or they will call the sheriff to forcibly remove your belongings." I opened the envelope and pulled out the eviction notice. The language was aggressive and immediate, demanding I leave the property by tomorrow afternoon. But my eyes bypassed the legal threats and scanned down to the fine print at the bottom of the page. The new holding company that had purchased my building shared the exact same registered address as Trevor's wealth management firm. Trevor had not just offered me a buyout at the lawyer's office, he had already set the trap. They had bought my building out from under me to render me homeless on the exact same day Desmond rendered me penniless. They were cutting off every avenue of survival to force my hand. I did not waste a single moment shedding tears over an apartment. Within 2 hours, I had packed my clothes, my essential documents, and my specialized auditing equipment into the trunk of my car. I handed my keys to a very apologetic Sarah and drove away without looking back in the rearview mirror. I headed straight to my small accounting office in a modest commercial park on the other side of town. The rent for the office was paid up for the next 6 months, making it the only sanctuary Desmond and Trevor could not immediately touch. I dragged my suitcases inside, locked the heavy deadbolt, and made a strong pot of black coffee. The small leather sofa in the corner would serve as my bed, but sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. I booted up my primary workstation and opened my forensic accounting software. Trevor wanted to play financial warfare with a woman who tracked hidden money for a living. I was going to show him exactly why my grandfather had trusted me with a $12 million empire. I began running deep traces on the shell company that had purchased my apartment building. I pulled public property records, cross-referenced them with state business registries, and started mapping out the corporate structure Trevor used to hide his acquisitions. It was a tedious process, sorting through layers of fake executives and ghost addresses, but I had built my reputation on finding the truth buried beneath the numbers. The phone on my desk rang, shattering the quiet hum of the office. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times before pressing the answer button. "Carmen, darling." Vivian's voice floated through the speaker, dripping with artificial sweetness. "I have been so worried about you today." The sheer hypocrisy of her tone was almost impressive. She was acting as if her husband had not just frozen my bank accounts, and her son-in-law had not just thrown me out onto the street. I kept my voice perfectly flat and gave nothing away. "What do you want, Vivian?" She sighed, a delicate and breathy sound that she usually reserved for high society church gatherings. "Your father and I think things got entirely too heated at the lawyer's office today. We are a family, Carmen. We should not be fighting through court orders and lawyers. I am hosting my annual charity gala this Saturday evening. All the community leaders and important investors will be there. I want you to come. We can sit down at a private table, have a civilized conversation, and figure out a solution that works for everyone." I knew exactly what she was doing. Vivian cared about public image more than she cared about oxygen. She wanted to lure me to an elite social event, surround me with the most powerful people in Atlanta's high society, and use the intense pressure of the crowd to force me into signing Trevor's check. She wanted to play the role of the benevolent and forgiving mother who was graciously saving her troubled daughter from financial ruin before the watchful eyes of her peers. I played along, letting a hint of manufactured defeat slip into my voice. "I do not have many options right now, do I?" I said softly. Vivian practically purred with satisfaction. "We will take care of you, darling. Just come to the gala. We will make all this unpleasantness go away quietly." I ended the call and turned my attention back to the glowing monitors. I had finally penetrated the thick layers of Trevor's shell company. I was looking at the origin account for the massive funds used to purchase my apartment building. My eyes scanned the routing numbers, verifying the complex data 3 times to ensure I was not making a mistake. The money had not come from Trevor's private wealth management firm. It had not come from an investment pool. It had been wired directly from a nonprofit trust account. I pulled up the state registration for the trust. It was a charitable foundation dedicated to providing housing assistance for underprivileged families in Atlanta. The chairwoman of that foundation was Vivian. Trevor had used his mother-in-law's charity money funds, specifically meant for the poor and vulnerable, to purchase a private commercial property, just so he could evict me. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face for the first time that day. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner, but they had just handed me the absolute key to their destruction. I picked up my phone and typed a brief text message to my mother. "I will be at the gala." The air in the grand ballroom of the hotel was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the quiet hum of jazz. I stepped through the gilded doors wearing a sharply tailored black pantsuit that I had bought off the rack 3 years ago. It was simple, structural, and strictly business. It stood out in a sea of custom silk gowns and velvet tuxedo jackets. The annual Community Empowerment Gala was the crown jewel of Atlanta high society, a place where political favors were traded over champagne flutes and reputations were bought and sold. I stood near the back of the room, by a towering floral arrangement, and watched my family work the crowd. They were a well-oiled machine of deception. My father Desmond was holding court near the main bar, shaking hands with city planners and local judges, flashing that perfectly practiced political smile. He looked like the ultimate public servant, a man entirely devoted to his community. A few yards away, my mother Vivian was speaking to a circle of wealthy donors. She was gesturing dramatically, likely boasting about the tireless work of her housing charity. The irony made my stomach turn. I knew exactly where her charity funds were actually going. I had tracked the wire transfers to Trevor's shell company just hours ago, and there was Trevor standing near the center of the room with my sister Lauren wrapped around his arm. He held a glass of scotch and was loudly explaining some complicated market trend to a group of older gentlemen, playing the role of the brilliant financial savior. Lauren was preening for the society photographers, her neck heavy with diamonds. I remained in the shadows, observing the mechanics of their fraud, waiting for the right moment to make my presence known. I did not look at them as family members. I looked at them the same way I looked at a corrupted spreadsheet. They were liabilities disguising themselves as assets. But Desmond had always possessed an uncanny ability to spot a threat. His eyes scanned the room and locked onto mine. His political smile did not falter, but I saw the sudden cold calculation in his gaze. He leaned over to one of the event organizers and whispered something. A moment later, the jazz band abruptly stopped playing. The lights dimmed over the dining tables, and a bright spotlight illuminated the main stage. Desmond walked up the steps and took the microphone. The room fell into an attentive hush. "Thank you all for being here tonight to support the future of our beautiful city." Desmond began, his baritone voice echoing through the massive speakers. "We talk a lot about community in this room. We talk about building legacies, but true legacy begins at home. It begins with family." He paused dramatically, letting the silence build. "As many of you know, my father Elijah passed away recently. It has been a difficult time for our family, filled with grief and unfortunate misunderstandings. But tonight is about healing. Tonight is about forgiveness." Desmond raised his hand and pointed directly at me. The spotlight swung across the room, blinding me for a second before bathing me in a harsh white glow. Hundreds of faces turned to stare at me. "My youngest daughter Carmen is here tonight," Desmond announced, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. "She has been lost for a long time. She made some regrettable choices regarding her grandfather's estate out of confusion and grief. But she has come here tonight to make things right. She has come to return the assets to the family trust where they belong so we can continue our father's philanthropic work. Come up here, Carmen. Let us show this city what family unity looks like. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Desmond was using the immense social pressure of the entire room to trap me. If I argued, I would look like the greedy, unstable daughter ruining a beautiful charity event. If I walked away, I would validate his narrative that I was a bitter outcast. He was trying to publicly corner me into surrendering $12 million before I had a chance to present my case in a courtroom. I kept my face completely devoid of emotion. I walked slowly through the parted crowd, feeling their judgmental stares pressing into my back. I climbed the stairs to the stage. Desmond reached out to pull me into a paternal embrace. I stopped just out of his reach. He quickly grabbed my hand instead, raising it in the air for the cameras. The crowd erupted into applause. He leaned in close to my ear, his smile never dropping for the photographers. "Sign the papers tomorrow morning, or I will ruin you in this city forever," he whispered through his teeth. I pulled my hand away with a calm, measured movement. I stepped toward the microphone stand. I looked out at the sea of wealthy donors and corrupt politicians. "I am here to ensure that my grandfather's true legacy is protected," I said clearly, my voice ringing out over the applause. "And I promise you all that every single stolen dollar will be brought into the light." The crowd cheered louder, completely missing the threat hidden in my words. But Desmond understood. I saw the muscle in his jaw twitch. I turned and walked down the steps of the stage, my heart beating with steady, rhythmic precision. I needed to leave before they attempted another public stunt. Before I could reach the exit doors, Lauren stepped into my path, blocking my way. She threw her arms around my neck in a fake, exaggerated hug for a nearby photographer. She pressed her cheek against mine and lowered her voice to a venomous hiss. "You look pathetic in that cheap suit," she whispered. "Enjoy your 15 minutes of fame while it lasts. Trevor just bought me these new diamonds to celebrate the villa we are closing on next week. You are going to lose everything, Carmen, and I am going to love watching you crawl." I pulled back from Lauren's toxic embrace and looked at the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. A brilliant idea sparked in my mind. I did not walk out the exit doors. Instead, I turned around and marched directly back up the steps to the main stage. Desmond was still standing there, waving to the crowd, assuming his little public stunt had successfully broken my spirit. He did not expect me to walk right up to him and pluck the microphone straight from his hand. His political smile froze on his face. I turned to the audience, projecting a bright and warm expression that matched the fake sincerity my family had just displayed. "Thank you all so much for such a warm welcome." I began, my voice smooth and practiced, echoing through the massive ballroom speakers. "It truly is a blessing to be back with my family tonight, especially knowing how deeply they care about charity and community sacrifice." I looked over at Desmond, who was staring at me with a mixture of confusion and rising panic. In fact, I think we should all give a special round of applause to my father, Councilman Desmond. It is incredibly inspiring that a man of his stature chose to arrive tonight in a standard rented town car instead of his usual luxury vehicle, just so he could donate the difference to the foundation. A low murmur rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy donors and political elites exchanged puzzled glances, looking toward the stage. Desmond prided himself on his fleet of expensive cars. Arriving in a rented town car was a glaring sign of a sudden cash flow problem, not a charitable sacrifice. I saw Desmond's face flush a deep, unnatural red, but he was trapped by his own public image. He had to stand there and nod gracefully while the crowd offered a confused smattering of applause. He gripped the edge of the podium, his knuckles turning white. But I was not finished. I turned my attention to the floor where Lauren was standing frozen next to Trevor. "And we must also applaud my beautiful sister, Lauren," I continued, leaning closer to the microphone. "She is wearing such a stunning diamond necklace tonight to celebrate the villa they are closing on next week. Her dedication to this charity is so absolute that she is giving until it literally hurts. I was speaking with the catering staff earlier, and they mentioned her black card was declined twice at the VIP charity bar. It takes true humility to experience public card rejections just to ensure every available dollar goes to the cause. Thank you, Lauren, for your sacrifice. The silence that fell over the grand ballroom was absolute and suffocating. The whispers started a second later, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. High society thrives on gossip, and financial vulnerability is the ultimate scandal. Eyes darted toward Lauren, who looked like she might actually faint. Her hands flew to her neck, covering the diamonds as if they were suddenly burning her skin. Trevor stood beside her, his face pale and contorted with silent fury. He knew exactly what I had done. I had used my forensic accounting instincts to look for the cracks in their facade, and I had exposed them to the very people they were trying to impress. Vivian could not take it anymore. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy family was shattering in real time. She hiked up her expensive silk gown and practically sprinted up the stairs to the stage, her pearls bouncing against her chest. Her eyes were wild with rage as she lunged toward me, reaching out with perfectly manicured hands to snatch the microphone away. I sidestepped her clumsy attempt with ease, keeping a firm grip on the mic stand. I smiled at her, adopting the demeanor of a forensic accountant, calmly presenting an audit report. "We just have to be so careful with our community funds," I said, my voice carrying a note of deep fake concern, "especially given the rumors circulating in the financial district. We want to ensure complete transparency, since Trevor S. Wealth Management Firm is currently dealing with that unfortunate shadow investigation for tax evasion. I know my family will cooperate fully with the authorities to clear his good name." The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The polite whispers turned into loud, frantic conversations. Investors who had money parked in Trevor S. firm were suddenly pulling out their phones, typing furious messages to their brokers. A shadow investigation for tax evasion was the kind of rumor that could trigger a massive bank run by Monday morning. I had just introduced a lethal dose of financial poison into their carefully curated ecosystem. I turned to Vivian, who was hyperventilating beside me. I gently pressed the microphone into her trembling hands. "Thank you for the lovely evening, Mother," I whispered, so only she could hear. "Next time, do not invite an auditor to a charity scam." I walked down the steps of the stage, my head held high. The crowd parted for me, parting like the Red Sea. No one wanted to stand too close to the blast zone. I headed straight for the heavy oak exit doors at the back of the ballroom. I had delivered my counterstrike, and it was time to leave before security was called or damage control could be organized. But as I pushed through the swinging doors into the dimly lit hallway leading to the coat check, a heavy hand clamped down on my forearm. The grip was brutal, dragging me backward into a dark, recessed alcove near the service elevators. I stumbled, but caught my balance, looking up to see Trevor looming over me. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The suave, arrogant wealth manager was gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. "You think you are so clever, Carmen?" he hissed, his fingers digging into my arm like a vice. "You think you can walk in here and ruin my reputation with baseless rumors?" "They are not baseless, Trevor," I replied, keeping my voice completely steady despite the pain shooting up my arm. "You used Vivian S. Charity Trust to buy my apartment building. That is a direct violation of tax-exempt status. It is wire fraud, it is embezzlement. And by Monday morning, the IRS will have a complete anonymous dossier detailing every single illegal transaction." Trevor laughed, a harsh, manic sound that echoed off the hallway walls. He leaned in so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You are going to sign the estate over to us tomorrow, or I will destroy your entire life," he threatened. "You think you can prove the old man was competent? I have medical records, Carmen. I have sworn affidavits from 3 different private physicians proving Elijah had advanced dementia. I will submit them to the probate court. I will have the will thrown out, and I will have you criminally charged for manipulating a sick old man. I will bury you so deep you will never see daylight again." He was bluffing. He had to be bluffing. But the absolute confidence in his eyes made my stomach drop. If he had managed to bribe medical professionals to forge dementia records, my timeline of my grandfather's mental clarity would be completely undermined. It would be a messy, drawn-out legal war that I did not have the funds to fight. I opened my mouth to respond, but a sudden violent buzzing interrupted me. Trevor's phone was vibrating frantically in his tuxedo jacket pocket. He ignored it, keeping his eyes locked on mine, trying to maintain his intimidation tactic. But the phone buzzed again and again, a relentless, frantic rhythm demanding attention. "Answer it, Trevor," I said softly, pulling my arm out of his loosened grip. "It might be important." He sneered at me, but pulled the phone from his pocket. The screen illuminated the dark alcove, casting a pale blue light over his face. I watched his eyes dart across the screen. I watched the arrogant confidence completely vanish, replaced by a look of pure, paralyzing panic. He stared at the notification, his mouth slightly open, unable to comprehend what he was reading. I did not need to see the screen to know what it said. I had initiated the protocol right before I walked into the ballroom. The notification was a banking alert. It was a failed wire transfer for the massive villa he was supposed to close on. His accounts were bleeding and the freeze had officially begun. I watched the color completely drain from Trevor's face. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The arrogant wealth manager was gone, leaving behind a terrified man staring at a digital death sentence. His grip on my arm had gone completely slack. I did not say another word. I simply stepped out of the dark alcove and walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the coat check, leaving him hyperventilating in the shadows. I retrieved my car keys, stepped out into the humid Atlanta night, and took my first real breath of the evening. The valet brought my car around, and I tipped him with the last $5 bill in my pocket. As I drove away from the glowing facade of the hotel, my mind immediately shifted back into analytical gear. Trevor's panic was too raw. It was too absolute. That level of terror did not come from simply losing a luxury villa or facing a temporary liquidity issue. That was the look of a man who realized his entire house of cards was collapsing. He had desperately needed my grandfather's $12 million, not just to enrich himself, but to cover up something massive. He needed that inheritance to plug a bleeding hole in his own firm. But how deep did the corruption go, and how much did my grandfather actually know before he died? I gripped the steering wheel as a sudden memory surfaced. The probate lawyers had cataloged every bank account, every commercial lease, and every digital asset belonging to Elijah. But they had missed something. They missed it because it was not written on a server or filed in a safety deposit box. It was a physical relic from a time before digital banking. I remembered a rainy afternoon when I was 10 years old, hiding under the heavy mahogany desk in my grandfather's study. I had watched him roll back the corner of the massive Persian rug, lift a hidden floorboard, and spin the dial of a heavy iron floor safe. He never told me what was inside, and I had never asked. But if Elijah knew about the financial crimes of his own son and son-in-law, the proof would not be sitting on a hackable hard drive. It would be in that safe. The problem was the house. Desmond had secured an emergency order to seal the property, citing the ongoing probate dispute. He claimed it was to prevent me from stealing valuables. I pulled my car into a dark 24-hour grocery store parking lot miles away from my office. I opened my trunk and quickly stripped off my tailored pantsuit, changing into a dark hooded sweatshirt, black jeans, and running shoes. If I was going to be accused of trespassing, I might as well dress the part. I drove to my grandfather's neighborhood, parking my car 3 streets over in a quiet cul-de-sac. The air was thick and heavy with the promise of rain as I walked through the familiar wooded path that bordered the back of Elijah's estate. The dense canopy of oak trees hid me from the moonlight. As I reached the edge of the tree line, I stopped and crouched behind a thick row of hydrangea bushes. The house was entirely dark, but the property was far from abandoned. 2 men in black tactical gear were standing on the back patio smoking cigarettes. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping across the manicured lawn in regular intervals. These were not standard county sheriffs or bank-appointed security guards enforcing a probate seal. They were private muscle. Trevor had hired his own security detail to lock down the house. They were not guarding the property to keep me out. They were guarding it because they were systematically searching it for whatever Elijah might have left behind. I watched their routine for 20 minutes. They were bored and overconfident. When the taller guard flicked his cigarette into the grass and turned the corner to patrol the side yard, the second guard pulled out his phone, turning his back to the house. This was my only window. I moved silently across the damp grass, staying low and keeping to the deep shadows cast by the large bay windows. I did not head for the back door. I slipped around the edge of the stone chimney toward the old cellar bulkhead. The iron cellar doors were padlocked with a heavy chain, but I knew the secret. When I was a teenager, I used to sneak out through this exact entrance. The hinges on the left side were completely rusted through the wood, underneath thoroughly rotted. I wedged my fingers under the heavy iron rim, took a breath, and pulled upward with all my strength. The door groaned a terrible scraping sound that made my heart hammer against my ribs, but it lifted just enough. I slid my body through the narrow gap, dropping onto the cold concrete stairs below. I lowered the iron door back into place just as the beam of a flashlight swept over the grass above my head. I stood in the pitch-black cellar listening to the heavy thud of the guard's boots walking right over the door I had just breached. I waited until his footsteps faded away before turning on the small penlight I kept on my keychain. The basement smelled of damp earth and old wood, a scent so intensely tied to my grandfather that it made my chest ache. I crept up the wooden stairs to the main floor, testing each step to avoid the ones I knew would creak. The inside of the house was a disaster. Drawers had been pulled out and dumped onto the floor. Cushions were slashed. Books were swept off the shelves. Trevor S. men had been tearing the place apart looking for leverage. I moved quickly down the main hallway, holding my breath as I passed the large windows. I reached the heavy oak doors of the study and slipped inside, quietly closing them behind me. The study had been ransacked, but the heavy Persian rug was still perfectly centered under the massive desk. They had not found it. I dropped to my knees, shoved the heavy desk chair aside, and grabbed the thick woolen edge of the rug. I hauled it back, exposing the dark hardwood floor. My fingers traced the familiar grooves in the wood until I found the small concealed notch. I pressed down and the floorboard popped up, revealing the dull gray dial of the floor safe. I stared at the metal dial, my mind racing. I did not know the combination. Elijah had never written it down. I closed my eyes and placed my fingers on the cold metal. I thought about the man who had taken me in when my parents abandoned me. I thought about the only day that truly mattered to him. I spun the dial to the right, stopping at 02. I spun it to the left, stopping at 14. I spun it back to the right, stopping at 96. February 14th, 1996. The exact date he had found a freezing 8-month-old baby on his front porch. I grasped the heavy handle and pulled. The thick metal locks disengaged with a heavy mechanical clunk, and the door swung open. I shined my penlight down into the dark cavity, expecting to find stacks of emergency cash or perhaps old stock certificates. But the safe was completely empty, except for a single object resting at the bottom. It was a thick leather-bound ledger. I reached down and pulled it out, brushing a thin layer of dust from the cover. I opened the heavy cover and flipped to the very first page. The neat, precise handwriting belonged entirely to my grandfather. I moved my light across the ink, and the breath completely vanished from my lungs. The very first entry was neatly dated and terrifyingly clear. Extortion payment to Desmond for the City Housing Fund. I stared at the ink on the page as the reality of those words washed over me. Extortion payment to Desmond. It was not a loan. It was not a gift. It was blackmail. I closed the heavy leather cover and tucked the ledger securely under my arm inside my dark hoodie. I could not stay in this house a second longer. The sweeping beam of a flashlight cut across the ceiling of the study, reminding me that Trevor S. private security guards were still circling the perimeter. I dropped the rug back into place, kicking the heavy desk chair over the hidden floorboard to conceal any trace of my intrusion. I crept back through the dark hallways, retracing my steps to the cellar door. The rusted iron hinges groaned slightly as I squeezed my way out into the humid night air. But the guards were on the opposite side of the property, arguing over a lighter. I melted into the tree line and did not stop running until I reached my car. Back in the safety of my rented office, I locked the deadbolt and turned on the small desk lamp. The clock on my computer read 2 in the morning. I brewed another pot of black coffee and cracked open my grandfather's ledger. For the next 6 hours, I did not move from my chair. The rest of the world faded away, leaving only columns of numbers, dates, and routing codes. Forensic accounting is not just about finding missing money. It is about understanding the story that the numbers are desperately trying to tell. My grandfather had meticulously documented a decade of financial terror. I set up a massive spreadsheet on my dual monitors, cross-referencing every single handwritten entry in Elijah's ledger with the public city budgets and Desmond's campaign finance disclosures. The pattern was horrifyingly clear. 10 years ago, Desmond's first major political campaign had run into a massive deficit. He had overspent mismanaged funds and faced a brutal public audit that would have ended his career before it even began. Instead of taking responsibility, he had turned to Elijah. The first entry in the ledger was for $200,000. Beside the amount, Elijah had written a brief note detailing Desmond's threat to use his new city council position to block the zoning permits on Elijah's commercial properties if he did not pay up. My own father had been blackmailing the man who raised me. The extortion had not stopped after that first campaign. As Desmond's political ambitions grew, his need for illicit cash multiplied. Every time he needed to cover up a misallocated campaign fund or bribe a city contractor, he squeezed Elijah. The ledger documented years of systematic elder abuse. Desmond had weaponized local government regulations against his own father, forcing Elijah to quietly liquidate smaller properties to meet Desmond's endless demands for cash. Trevor was likely laundering the extorted money through his wealth management firm, creating clean trails for the dirty funds to enter Desmond's political war chest. They had been bleeding an old man dry for a decade under the threat of destroying his life's work. The sheer cruelty of it made my chest tight. Desmond had stood in a courtroom and accused me of financial manipulation when he had spent the last 10 years running a ruthless extortion racket against a vulnerable senior citizen. But my grandfather was a survivor. Elijah knew he was being victimized, and he knew he could not go to the corrupt local authorities. So he did what any brilliant businessman would do. He built an unbreakable paper trail. He gathered the exact account numbers, the offshore routing codes, and the dates of every illegal transfer. He had left me the map to Desmond's grave. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale gray light through the blinds of my office, but I was not finished. I had traced the historical extortion, but I needed to understand the immediate desperation. Desmond and Trevor were moving with reckless speed. Buying my apartment building, freezing my accounts, and staging public ambushes at charity galas were not the actions of calculating men. They were the actions of terrified men. I looked at the final pages of the ledger. The entries became more erratic during the last few months of Elijah's life. Desmond's demands had escalated dramatically. I pulled up the current fiscal year reports for the city of Atlanta, focusing heavily on the committees Desmond chaired. I ran a comparative analysis against the final routing numbers written in the back of the ledger. My accounting software flagged a massive discrepancy almost immediately. I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing the digital path of a catastrophic financial crime. Just 1 week before my grandfather suffered his fatal stroke, a staggering $12.4 million had been quietly siphoned out of the city housing fund. It was the exact same fund Vivian supposedly championed for her charity. The money had been routed through a series of complex shell corporations designed to look like legitimate civic development grants. But the end destination was a private offshore account controlled by Trevor. They had stolen public money to cover a catastrophic loss in Trevor's firm. but the theft was too large to hide forever. I tapped into the state legislative schedule and found my answer. A mandatory independent state audit of the City Housing Fund was scheduled to begin in less than 2 weeks. The entire puzzle clicked together with devastating precision. Desmond and Trevor had stolen $12.4 million from the city, relying on Elijah to bail them out one last time. They had expected my grandfather to quietly transfer his liquid assets to cover their tracks before the state auditors arrived. But Elijah had finally said no. He had refused to pay their ransom. Instead, he had updated his will, leaving every single penny to me, and sealing his wealth away from their greedy hands. Now Desmond was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. He did not just want my inheritance out of spite. He desperately needed exactly $12 million from the estate to replace the stolen city funds before the state auditors uncovered his massive theft. If he did not get my signature on that surrender document within a matter of days, a city councilman and a prominent wealth manager were going to federal prison. The morning sun was just beginning to hit the Atlanta skyline when I parked across the street from the downtown branch of my grandfather's bank. I had spent the entire night mapping the extortion payments from the ledger, but I needed the final piece of the puzzle. I needed to know how the actual transfers were executed, and there was only one person Elijah trusted with his primary accounts. Marcus was the senior branch manager, an older black gentleman with a sharp mind and a fierce loyalty to my grandfather. He had managed Elijah's accounts for over 30 years. They were more than business associates. They were friends who played chess every other Sunday at the park. I waited until I saw Marcus walking toward the employee entrance holding his usual black briefcase and a cup of coffee. I intercepted him on the sidewalk. When he saw me, his eyes widened, and he quickly looked around to see if anyone was watching us. He motioned for me to follow him down a narrow alley beside the bank building, stepping into the shadows out of view of the security cameras. "I cannot be seen talking to you, Carmen," he said, his voice hushed and hurried. "Trevor came into the branch 2 days ago. He had the regional director with him. He told me that if I so much as breathed a word about your grandfather's accounts to you, he would have me terminated immediately and find a way to strip my pension. He is terrified of what you might find." I looked at Marcus, seeing the exhaustion in his face. I told him I understood, and that I would not put his retirement at risk, but I had found the hidden ledger in the floor safe. I told him I knew about Desmond's extortion and the missing $12 million from the city fund. Marcus closed his eyes and let out a long, heavy sigh. He leaned against the brick wall of the alleyway, shaking his head. "Elijah carried that burden for a decade," Marcus said, his voice thick with sorrow. "He paid your father to keep the peace to protect the family name, but the demands just kept getting worse. A week before he died, Elijah came to my office. He was a broken man, Carmen. He knew they were going to use his estate to cover up something massive. He knew his legacy was going to be swallowed by their dirty money." Marcus reached into his briefcase. He bypassed his neatly organized folders and unzipped a small hidden compartment lining the bottom. He pulled out a small black digital audio recorder and pressed it into my hand. "Trevor thinks he confiscated all of Elijah's digital files," Marcus whispered, looking me directly in the eyes. "But your grandfather gave this to me for safekeeping. He told me to give it to you if they ever tried to force you out. He wanted you to hear it from him. He loved you very much, Carmen. He knew you were the only one strong enough to stop them." I gripped the small recorder, feeling the weight of my grandfather's final act of defiance. I thanked Marcus, telling him I would make sure he was protected when the dust settled. He gave me a sad smile, told me to give them hell, and walked back out to the street toward the bank entrance. I sat in my car, locking the doors and staring at the digital recorder. The air inside the vehicle felt completely still. I pressed the play button and brought the small speaker close to my ear. A familiar sound filled the quiet space of my car. It was the heavy, labored breathing of my grandfather. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with an emotion I had never heard from him before. He sounded terrified and deeply, profoundly tired. "Carmen, if you are hearing this, it means I am gone, and Desmond has made his move. Elijah's recorded voice echoed in the small space. I am so sorry, my brave girl. I am so sorry I left this mess for you to clean up. For 10 years, I let your father bleed me dry. I told myself I was protecting our family, but I was only feeding a monster. Last week, Desmond and Trevor demanded my entire liquid estate. They siphoned public funds from the city housing initiative, and they need my money to replace it before the state auditors arrive. They threatened to destroy everything I built if I did not comply. I listened as my grandfather began to quietly weep on the recording. The sound tore through my chest. The strong, invincible man who had raised me was sobbing alone into a microphone. I will not let them turn my life's work into a slush fund for their crimes. Elijah continued, his voice gaining a sudden fierce clarity. I went to my lawyer yesterday and changed the will. I left everything to you, Carmen, because you are the only one with the moral compass to do what is right. Do not let them intimidate you. The city money they stole was routed through a specific offshore entity. They called it the Apex Horizon Group. Follow that company, Carmen. Follow the money. I love you. The recording clicked and went silent. I sat in my car, the tears streaming down my face. My grandfather had died trying to protect me, trying to protect his legacy from the very men who were supposed to be his family. I wiped my eyes and opened my laptop, resting it on the steering wheel. I connected to a secure mobile hotspot and bypassed the standard search engines, diving directly into the international corporate registry databases. Elijah had given me the exact name of the shell company, Apex Horizon Group. Desmond had always been careless with his digital footprints, relying on Trevor to hide his tracks. I ran a forensic trace on the registration documents, peeling back layers of proxy directors and fake holding addresses in the Cayman Islands. It took me 20 minutes to crack the final layer of ownership. When the true registration documents loaded on my screen, I stopped breathing. The name listed as the primary beneficiary and sole registered agent of the Apex Horizon Group was not Councilman Desmond. It was Trevor. My hands hovered over the keyboard as the massive implications crashed into my mind. Desmond had been blackmailing my grandfather for years, but the $12 million stolen from the city housing fund did not belong to my father. Trevor had set up the shell company himself. Trevor was the one holding the offshore account. He had not just facilitated Desmond's theft, he had orchestrated it and hijacked the funds. Trevor was playing everyone, including my father, and he was going to let Desmond take the fall when the state auditors arrived. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile. My sister's brilliant wealth manager husband was about to become my ultimate weapon. I stared at Trevor's name on the offshore registration documents and let the beautiful reality of his treason wash over me. I needed to know exactly how deep his lies went. I opened a new encrypted search window and ran a full diagnostic on his so-called elite wealth management firm. The public-facing website was a masterpiece of corporate branding, featuring stock photos of smiling retirees and sleek glass boardrooms. Trevor loved to parade around my family, playing the role of the brilliant financial savior, a man with a white savior complex who turned everything he touched into gold. But when I bypassed the marketing facade and pulled the state corporate filings, the truth was absolutely pathetic. Trevor's firm had quietly filed for bankruptcy 2 years ago. He was not a financial genius. He was a professional grifter living on borrowed time and stolen money. I dug deeper, pulling up the public property records for the luxury estate he shared with my sister Lauren. The house was supposedly paid off, a lavish wedding gift from Desmond, to ensure his favorite daughter lived in absolute comfort. But the registry showed a massive secondary mortgage taken out just 8 months ago. I pulled the digitized signature card. Lauren's elegant looping handwriting was right there at the bottom of the loan agreement, but the notary stamp belonged to a man who worked exclusively for Trevor. Trevor had tricked his own wife into signing away the equity on their home, probably burying the document in a stack of routine investment paperwork and telling her to just sign on the dotted line. He had leveraged her house to keep up the illusion of his wealth while he bled dry. But draining his own marital assets was clearly not enough to sustain his fake billionaire lifestyle. I cross-referenced Trevor's personal shell companies with Desmond's political action committee. Desmond had always bragged about his massive campaign war chest, assuming his perfect son-in-law was managing the funds with Wall Street precision. Instead, the accounting trail showed a persistent parasitic skimming operation. For the past 24 months, Trevor had been quietly diverting campaign donations, labeling them as abstract administrative fees and consulting retainers. He was robbing my father blind right under his nose. The $12.4 million stolen from the City Housing Fund was not just a political cover-up. It was Trevor's desperate Hail Mary pass to replace the money he had already lost. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my exhausted eyes. My family was a nest of vipers, all cannibalizing each other while pretending to be high society royalty. Desmond thought he was the mastermind extorting my grandfather to fund his political empire, but he was entirely oblivious to the fact that his chosen golden boy was bankrupting him from the inside. Trevor was holding the stolen $12 million offshore, waiting to see if Desmond could force me to surrender the estate. If I caved, Desmond would use my grandfather's money to replace the missing city funds, and Trevor would walk away with the stolen $12 million free and clear. If I fought and Desmond went down for the missing city funds, Trevor would just take the offshore money and vanish, leaving Lauren holding a mountain of debt and public disgrace. I needed to corner him. I needed to let Trevor know that I held the detonator to his entire fraudulent life. I picked up my phone and drafted a single text message to his private number. Apex Horizon Group is a fascinating investment strategy, Trevor. I wonder how Desmond will feel when I show him your consulting fees. I pressed send and watched the delivery confirmation pop up on the screen. I did not expect a reply. I just wanted him to sweat. I wanted him to look across the breakfast table at my arrogant sister and know that a broke forensic accountant holding a burner phone was about to dismantle his existence piece by piece. The sun was fully up now, baking the Atlanta asphalt outside my office window. I stood up and stretched my aching muscles, preparing to draft the final report I would hand over to the federal authorities on Monday morning. I had the ledger, I had the audio recording, and I had the offshore banking trails. It was a bulletproof case. I walked over to the small break room area to pour myself a glass of water, feeling the adrenaline of victory pumping through my veins. A heavy, sudden pounding on my office door shattered the morning silence. I froze my hand, tightening around the glass. No one knew I rented this small commercial space. It was leased under a dummy corporation I had set up years ago specifically for quiet forensic work. The pounding came again, louder this time, shaking the frosted glass pane of the door. Carmen Wilson, a deep voice barked from the hallway. "Open the door! We know you are in there." I set the glass down and walked slowly toward the entrance. I checked the security monitor wired to the hallway camera. Two men in dark suits stood outside holding thick manila folders. They were not police officers. They were private process servers, the expensive, aggressive kind that elite law firms used when they wanted to intimidate someone. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches, keeping my foot wedged behind it. "Are you Carmen Wilson?" the taller man asked, shoving the heavy manila folder through the narrow gap in the door. He did not wait for an answer. "You have been officially served." The two men turned and walked away down the corridor, their dress shoes clicking loudly against the linoleum. I pulled the folder inside and locked the door behind me, my heart beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I tore open the seal and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. It was an emergency court summons from the county probate division. I scanned the dense legal text, my eyes catching on the signature of the presiding judge. It was Judge Harrison, a man notorious for his deep political ties to Desmond's campaign committee. Desmond had cashed in a massive political favor. He had bribed a corrupt local judge to completely bypass the standard probate waiting period. The document stated that an emergency evidentiary hearing to officially invalidate Elijah's will on the grounds of severe mental incompetence had been fast-tracked. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Desmond and Trevor were not waiting for me to surrender. They were using the corrupt local court system to legally strip me of the estate before I could even present my case. I had exactly 48 hours to stop them from stealing my grandfather's legacy. I tossed the subpoena onto my desk and took a deep breath. 48 hours. That was all the time I had left to dismantle a 10-year criminal conspiracy. I was just opening my forensic accounting software to compile the final evidence packets when another knock echoed through the frosted glass of my office door. It was lighter this time. A sharp, impatient tapping that I recognized instantly. I did not bother checking the security monitor. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. My older sister Lauren stood in the hallway looking like she had just stepped off the cover of a luxury lifestyle magazine. She wore a tailored white pantsuit, oversized sunglasses pushed back into her perfectly blown-out blonde hair, and a smug smile that practically radiated entitlement. She did not wait for an invitation before pushing past me and stepping into my small workspace. She slowly took off her sunglasses and looked around the room, her nose wrinkling in disgust at the mismatched filing cabinets and the cheap fluorescent lighting. "So this is where you have been hiding," Lauren said, her voice dripping with condescension. I have to admit, Carmen, it is even more pathetic than I imagined. I suppose this is what happens when you decide to play detective, instead of just accepting your place in the family. I closed the door and leaned against it, crossing my arms. I asked her what she wanted. "I came to do you a favor," Lauren said, pacing across the worn carpet and trailing the heavy scent of an expensive floral perfume. "I wanted to give you one last chance to save yourself the public humiliation on Monday morning. Trevor told me about the subpoena. It is over, Carmen. Daddy and Trevor have the judge in their pocket, and they are going to prove that grandfather was completely senile when he changed that will. If you sign the surrender documents now, they might actually let you keep a tiny fraction of the money out of pity. If you fight us in court on Monday, you will walk away with absolutely nothing." I walked over to my small coffee station and picked up the glass pot. I asked her if she wanted a cup. She rolled her eyes and let out a sharp laugh. "You are making coffee right now. Are you even listening to me? We have won, Carmen. Trevor is already finalizing the paperwork for our new life. He is buying a historic villa in Tuscany. It has vineyards and a private olive grove, and we are moving to Italy as soon as the estate is settled next week. We are going to be European royalty while you are stuck in this depressing little office auditing tax returns for pennies." I poured the dark liquid into a ceramic mug and took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the silence stretch between us, watching my sister gloat about a future that was never going to happen. She was so blinded by her own arrogance that she could not see the reality crumbling right beneath her feet. I looked closely at her outfit, letting my eyes travel from the bag draped over her arm to the jewelry glittering on her wrist to the designer shoes on her feet. "That is a fascinating plan, Lauren," I said, resting my mug on the counter. "But I am curious about how you are going to afford a villa in Tuscany when your husband is buying you counterfeit accessories." Lauren froze. Her confident smile slipped for a fraction of a second before she recovered, forcing out a loud, mocking laugh. "You are clearly losing your mind, Carmen. Trevor bought me this bag in Paris last month. It cost more than you make in an entire year." I stepped closer to her, setting my coffee down. I pointed to the heavy leather handbag she was clutching so desperately. "The stitching on the handles of an authentic luxury bag is always angled because it is hand-sewn with a saddle stitch." I explained, my voice perfectly calm and level. "The stitching on your bag is perfectly straight, which means it was machine-sewn. It is a high-end replica, Lauren, a very good fake, but still a fake." Lauren pulled the bag behind her back, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "You do not know what you are talking about. You are just jealous." I did not stop there. I pointed to the gold designer bracelet circling her wrist. "And that bracelet," I continued, watching her eyes widen in panic. "Authentic luxury pieces use solid 18-karat gold, which does not tarnish or discolor. Look at the inside edge of your wrist, Lauren. The metal is turning green where it rubs against your skin. It is gold-plated brass. Trevor did not buy that in a boutique. He bought it from a replica dealer." I looked down at her feet. "And those red bottom heels you are wearing? The designer uses a specific grade of leather for their soles that scuffs and wears down with a distinctive matte finish." Yours have a glossy plastic sheen that is already peeling at the edges. They are mass-produced fakes. Your entire wardrobe is a costume funded by a man who is legally bankrupt. Stop it, Lauren shouted, taking a step backward. You are lying. Trevor is a billionaire. He manages wealth for the most powerful families in the state. He is securing our Tuscan villa right now. The sheer desperation in her voice was pathetic. She had built her entire identity around being the wealthy, successful daughter, and the illusion was cracking wide open right in front of me. I could have told her the whole ugly truth right then. I could have told her about the bankruptcy filings I had found. I could have told her about the second mortgage Trevor had tricked her into signing and how he had stripped every ounce of equity from her precious home. I could have explained that her husband was a professional grifter, surviving on stolen campaign funds and extorted money. But I needed her to figure out the most dangerous part of his plan entirely on her own. I needed the reality of Trevor's betrayal to destroy her from the inside out, because she was the only one close enough to him to disrupt his escape. I walked back to my desk and picked up a pen, rolling it slowly between my fingers. I looked at my sister, seeing the absolute terror hiding just behind her angry eyes. Her hands were gripping that fake bag so tightly, her knuckles were turning white. If Trevor is really taking you and the kids to live in Italy next week, I said, keeping my tone conversational and light, then I have a very simple question for you, Lauren. She glared at me, her chest heaving as she waited for me to speak. Ever wonder why Trevor keeps his passport on him lately, but has not applied for visas for you and the kids? The color instantly drained from Lauren's face, leaving her skin completely pale. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The heavy silence in my office was deafening as my words sank deep into her mind. She knew I was right. She knew Trevor had been acting erratic, keeping his travel documents locked in his briefcase, making secretive phone calls in the middle of the night, and avoiding any practical discussions about moving the children overseas. He had been liquidating their shared assets and moving the cash while telling her to just pack her bags for a European dream. I watched the devastating truth wash over my sister. Trevor was not buying a villa for the family. Trevor was planning to take the stolen $12 million and flee the country alone. He was going to abandon Lauren and the children, leaving them to face the federal investigators and the massive debt he had secretly accumulated in her name. You are lying, Lauren whispered, her voice trembling so badly it was barely audible. Go home and check his briefcase, Lauren. I said, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. Go home and look at the life you think you have, because by Monday morning the fantasy is over. Lauren did not say another word. She turned around and stumbled toward the door, her expensive fake heels slipping on the carpet. She practically ran down the hallway, leaving the door wide open behind her. I stood in my office listening to her frantic footsteps fade away. I had just planted a bomb in the center of Desmond's camp, and I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Trevor was about to realize that his perfect, compliant wife was no longer blind to his crimes, and the resulting chaos was going to give me exactly the opening I needed to strike before the judge could drop his gavel on Monday morning. I spent the entire weekend locked inside my rented office, compiling every single piece of the puzzle while the clock relentlessly ticked down to Monday morning. The silence of the empty commercial building was broken only by the steady mechanical hum of my printer spitting out bank statements and offshore registration documents. I knew the toxic seed of doubt I had planted in Lauren's mind was currently tearing my family apart from the inside. Trevor was likely scrambling in a blind panic to cover his tracks, while Desmond was undoubtedly screaming at his lawyers, trying to figure out why his perfect son-in-law was suddenly trying to flee the country. I had just finished organizing the final stack of financial disclosures when my encrypted burner phone began to vibrate violently across the desk. The caller ID showed a blocked number, but I knew exactly who it was. I pressed the accept button and brought the phone to my ear without saying a single word. Carmen. You vindictive little brat, my father, his voice hissed through the speaker. His tone completely lacked the usual polished politician cadence he used to charm his wealthy donors. He sounded breathless, erratic, and completely unhinged. You have no idea the kind of absolute damage you are causing right now. Lauren is completely hysterical, tearing the house apart, and Trevor is threatening to walk away from the campaign right before the biggest election of my career. You are trying to destroy your own family over a few pennies just because you are jealous of your sister. I kept my voice perfectly level and icy cold as I replied, telling him that stealing $12.4 million from a public housing fund to cover up a bad investment was hardly a few pennies. The line went dead silent for 3 agonizing seconds. I could hear the harsh, raspy intake of his breath through the receiver. He had thought his dirty secret was safe behind Trevor's offshore shell companies and layers of fake corporate identities. He had absolutely no idea I had traced the stolen city money all the way to the Cayman Islands and linked it directly back to Trevor's personal accounts. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful failure." Desmond spat, his voice dropping to a dangerous, desperate whisper. "I am going to offer you a way out of this, because I am a generous man, and I want to protect the family name. I will authorize a $50,000 payout from the estate tomorrow morning. You take the money, you sign the surrender documents acknowledging your grandfather was mentally incompetent, and you disappear back to whatever pathetic little life you were living before this week. If you refuse me, and if you show up in Judge Harrison's courtroom tomorrow morning to contest the will, I promise I will completely destroy you. I have the county medical examiner on my personal payroll, Carmen. I will introduce newly discovered toxicology reports, proving you slowly poisoned Elijah to secure your inheritance. You will not just lose the money, you will spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a federal penitentiary for murder." I closed my eyes and listened to the sheer, absolute terror hiding behind his violent, fabricated threats. A powerful and arrogant city councilman was reduced to blackmailing his own daughter with fake murder charges simply because he was staring down the barrel of a massive federal indictment. He did not have a toxicology report, and he certainly did not have the medical examiner in his pocket. He was bluffing, throwing wild, desperate threats into the dark, hoping I would break under the pressure, just like I always did when I was a child. I told him he was a pathetic coward. I told him he had spent 10 brutal years extorting a vulnerable old man, and now he was trying to bully a woman who was no longer afraid of him or his corrupt political machine. I told him to keep his measly $50,000 because tomorrow morning I was going to take absolutely everything. "You are out of time, Desmond," I said, my voice echoing softly in the empty office. "The state auditors are coming for the housing fund, and Trevor does not have the money to save you because he lost it all years ago. Do not bother making any more empty threats because I will see you in court tomorrow." I ended the call before he could scream another word and tossed the burner phone directly into the metal trash can beside my desk. I turned my attention back to the massive pile of evidence covering my workspace. I gathered the printed copies of Elijah's handwritten extortion ledger, the bankruptcy filings from Trevor's fake wealth management firm, the secondary mortgage documents Lauren had blindly signed away, and the offshore bank routing numbers proving the city housing funds had been siphoned into Trevor's personal accounts. I placed the small USB drive containing the heartbreaking audio recording from Marcus securely into a clear plastic sleeve. I stacked every single page with meticulous precision and slid the entire damning collection into a thick, dark red, heavy-duty folder. The red file felt incredibly heavy in my hands. It was the physical manifestation of my grandfather's silent suffering, and it was the blueprint for my family's ultimate downfall. The probate hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock in the morning, but I knew local corruption could easily bury the evidence if it was only presented in a compromised courtroom controlled by Desmond's friends. I needed a higher, unquestionable authority. I picked up my primary cell phone and dialed the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I navigated the automated phone menu until I reached the anonymous tip line specifically designated for public corruption and severe financial crimes. The recording beeped, prompting me to leave a message. "My name is not important," I said, speaking clearly and steadily into the receiver. "But I am reporting a catastrophic theft of $12.4 million from the Atlanta City Housing Initiative orchestrated by Councilman Desmond Wilson and his wealth manager Trevor Hayes. I have secured all the financial routing numbers, offshore account details, and sworn audio confessions, proving the extortion and the embezzlement. I have already dispatched the physical evidence via overnight courier. Please record this specific tracking number. I read the 12-digit tracking code slowly and deliberately, knowing it would lead the federal agents directly to the red file I was about to drop off at the secure shipping center. The package will arrive directly on the lead investigator's desk by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I concluded. I hung up the phone and grabbed my coat, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. The trap was set, the federal authorities were notified, and my family was entirely out of moves. The weekend evaporated into a blur of restless anticipation and the heavy weight of inevitable confrontation. When Monday morning finally arrived, I dressed in a tailored black suit that felt more like armor than clothing. I walked up the wide marble steps of the Fulton County Courthouse, feeling the cold morning air against my face. My grandfather had walked these same steps countless times, building his empire through legitimate contracts and honest handshakes. Today, I was walking them to tear down the parasites who had tried to feed on his legacy. I carried nothing but my leather briefcase containing a single copy of the original will and a small notebook. I had deliberately chosen not to hire a lawyer. An attorney would have advised caution and compromise, but I was not here to negotiate with criminals. I was here to execute my grandfather's final wishes. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4B and stepped into an absolute circus. Desmond had clearly been busy over the weekend, utilizing every single political favor he had left. The gallery benches were packed to maximum capacity with local reporters, political bloggers, and news cameras pointing directly toward the aisle. My father had orchestrated this entire spectacle to publicly humiliate me and secure his narrative as the grieving son dealing with a mentally unstable daughter. He wanted the city to watch him valiantly rescue the family estate from my greedy and incompetent hands. As I walked down the center aisle, the flashes of cameras illuminated the dim room, and journalists leaned over the wooden railing shouting questions at me. They asked if I was contesting the medical evaluation. They asked why I was trying to steal money meant for charity. My father had fed them a perfect script. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead and did not give them the satisfaction of a response. I walked past the murmuring crowd and took my seat at the defense table entirely alone. Directly across the aisle at the plaintiff table sat my so-called family, looking like a perfectly cast ensemble for a tragic play. They had arranged themselves to present a united front of sorrow and dignity. Desmond wore a dark, somber suit, his posture rigid and his jaw set in an expression of manufactured grief. Beside him, Vivian was already dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief, playing the part of the distraught stepmother, for the press pool sitting just rows behind her. She occasionally leaned her head on Desmond's shoulder, ensuring the cameras captured her performance of a heartbroken woman simply trying to honor her late father-in-law. Lauren sat next to Vivian, wearing a high-necked black designer dress and casting venomous glares in my direction. But beneath her aggressive posture, I could see the cracks in her foundation. She looked pale and exhausted, with deep dark circles under her eyes. It was obvious she had spent the weekend frantically searching Trevor's home office, finding the exact travel documents and hidden bank statements I had warned her about. Yet there she sat, clinging to her fake luxury handbag, too terrified of public embarrassment to actually confront the man sitting beside her. But it was Trevor who commanded my absolute attention. He slouched in his heavy wooden chair, whispering confidently to a team of 3 expensive corporate lawyers he had hired to steamroll me. Their table was covered in massive stacks of legal briefs and bound folders designed to look overwhelming and intimidating. When Trevor noticed me looking at him, he offered a slow, arrogant smirk. His eyes were cold and full of absolute disdain. He looked at me like I was a minor inconvenience, a pathetic little bug that was about to be permanently swatted away by his superior intellect. He was so certain of his victory. He was so deeply sure that Judge Harrison was going to walk through those doors and hand him the keys to the $12 million he desperately needed to cover his federal crimes. I opened my briefcase and pulled out my single legal pad and a pen, placing them in the center of the vast empty table. The contrast between my solitary setup and their army of attorneys caused a few reporters in the front row to snicker. Let them laugh, I thought. They had absolutely no idea that the real trial had already taken place over the weekend and that the verdict was currently sitting in a red folder on a federal investigator's desk. The court bailiff stood at the front of the room and called for order. The low hum of gossip and the rapid clicking of camera shutters immediately died down, leaving a thick, suffocating silence in the courtroom. Desmond leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood of his table, and gave me one final look of absolute warning. It was the same intimidating glare he used to give me when I was a child, right before he delivered a punishing lecture about my failures. I stared back at him without blinking, my face completely devoid of emotion. Trevor checked his luxury watch, the one I knew was a cheap replica, and adjusted his silk tie, clearly eager for the proceedings to begin so he could secure his escape funds. The heavy oak door behind the judicial bench clicked open and the bailiff instructed the entire courtroom to rise. We all stood in unison, waiting for the notoriously corrupt Judge Harrison to take his seat and rubber stamp my father's theft. I watched the door, expecting to see the familiar face of the local magistrate Desmond had bribed to fast-track this hearing, but the man who stepped through the doorway wearing a flowing black robe was someone entirely different. He was an older gentleman with sharp, piercing eyes and a stern, uncompromising expression that carried the weight of absolute authority. The murmurs in the gallery erupted once again as the press pool immediately recognized him. I glanced across the aisle and watched the smug confidence completely vanish from Trevor's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Desmond gripped the edge of his table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. His expensive corporate lawyers began to frantically whisper among themselves, flipping through their case files in a sudden blind panic. The man taking his seat at the high wooden bench was not the local probate judge they had paid off. It was the Honorable Marcus Sterling, a senior federal judge from the United States District Court. The federal authorities had received the red file, and they were not going to let Desmond and Trevor walk out of this room. I stared at the thick stack of legal documents and took a deep breath. 48 hours. That was all the time I had left to dismantle a 10-year criminal conspiracy. I was just opening my forensic accounting software to compile the final evidence packets when another knock echoed through the frosted glass of my office door. It was lighter this time, a sharp, impatient tapping that I recognized instantly. I did not bother checking the security monitor. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. My older sister Lauren stood in the hallway looking like she had just stepped off the cover of a luxury lifestyle magazine. She wore a tailored white pantsuit, oversized sunglasses pushed back into her perfectly blown-out blonde hair, and a smug smile that practically radiated entitlement. She did not wait for an invitation before pushing past me and stepping into my small workspace. She slowly took off her sunglasses and looked around the room, her nose wrinkling in disgust at the mismatched filing cabinets and the cheap fluorescent lighting. "So this is where you have been hiding," Lauren said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I have to admit, Carmen, it is even more pathetic than I imagined. I suppose this is what happens when you decide to play detective instead of just accepting your place in the family." I closed the door and leaned against it, crossing my arms. I asked her what she wanted. "I came to do you a favor," Lauren said, pacing across the worn carpet and trailing the heavy scent of an expensive floral perfume. "I wanted to give you one last chance to save yourself the public humiliation on Monday morning. Trevor told me about the subpoena." "It is over, Carmen. Daddy and Trevor have the judge in their pocket, and they are going to prove that grandfather was completely senile when he changed that will. If you sign the surrender documents now, they might actually let you keep a tiny fraction of the money out of pity. If you fight us in court on Monday, you will walk away with absolutely nothing." I walked over to my small coffee station and picked up the glass pot. I asked her if she wanted a cup. She rolled her eyes and let out a sharp laugh. "You are making coffee right now. Are you even listening to me? We have one, Carmen." Trevor is already finalizing the paperwork for our new life. He is buying a historic villa in Tuscany. It has vineyards and a private olive grove, and we are moving to Italy as soon as the estate is settled next week. We are going to be European royalty while you are stuck in this depressing little office, auditing tax returns for pennies. I poured the dark liquid into a ceramic mug and took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the silence stretch between us, watching my sister gloat about a future that was never going to happen. She was so blinded by her own arrogance that she could not see the reality crumbling right beneath her feet. I looked closely at her outfit, letting my eyes travel from the bag draped over her arm to the jewelry glittering on her wrist, to the designer shoes on her feet. "That is a fascinating plan, Lauren," I said, resting my mug on the counter. "But I am curious about how you are going to afford a villa in Tuscany when your husband is buying you counterfeit accessories." Lauren froze. Her confident smile slipped for a fraction of a second before she recovered, forcing out a loud, mocking laugh. "You are clearly losing your mind, Carmen. Trevor bought me this bag in Paris last month. It cost more than you make in an entire year." I stepped closer to her, setting my coffee down. I pointed to the heavy leather handbag she was clutching so desperately. The stitching on the handles of an authentic luxury bag is always angled because it is hand-sewn with a saddle stitch. I explained, my voice perfectly calm and level. "The stitching on your bag is perfectly straight, which means it was machine-sewn. It is a high-end replica, Lauren. A very good fake, but still a fake." Lauren pulled the bag behind her back, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "You do not know what you are talking about. You are just jealous." I did not stop there. I pointed to the gold designer bracelet circling her wrist. "And that bracelet?" I continued, watching her eyes widen in panic. "Authentic luxury pieces use solid 18-karat gold, which does not tarnish or discolor. Look at the inside edge of your wrist, Lauren. The metal is turning green where it rubs against your skin. It is gold-plated brass. Trevor did not buy that in a boutique. He bought it from a replica dealer." I looked down at her feet. "And those red bottom heels you are wearing? The designer uses a specific grade of leather for their soles that scuffs and wears down with a distinctive matte finish. Yours have a glossy plastic sheen that is already peeling at the edges. They are mass-produced fakes. Your entire wardrobe is a costume funded by a man who is legally bankrupt." "Stop it!" Lauren shouted, taking a step backward. "You are lying. Trevor is a billionaire. He manages wealth for the most powerful families in the state. He is securing our Tuscan villa right now." The sheer desperation in her voice was pathetic. She had built her entire identity around being the wealthy, successful daughter, and the illusion was cracking wide open right in front of me. I could have told her the whole ugly truth right then. I could have told her about the bankruptcy filings I had found. I could have told her about the second mortgage Trevor had tricked her into signing and how he had stripped every ounce of equity from her precious home. I could have explained that her husband was a professional grifter surviving on stolen campaign funds and extorted money. But I needed her to figure out the most dangerous part of his plan entirely on her own. I needed the reality of Trevor's betrayal to destroy her from the inside out, because she was the only one close enough to him to disrupt his escape. I walked back to my desk and picked up a pen, rolling it slowly between my fingers. I looked at my sister, seeing the absolute terror hiding just behind her angry eyes. Her hands were gripping that fake bag so tightly, her knuckles were turning white. "If Trevor is really taking you and the kids to live in Italy next week," I said, keeping my tone conversational and light, "then I have a very simple question for you, Lauren." She glared at me, her chest heaving as she waited for me to speak. "Ever wonder why Trevor keeps his passport on him lately, but has not applied for visas for you and the kids?" The color instantly drained from Lauren's face, leaving her skin completely pale. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The heavy silence in my office was deafening as my words sank deep into her mind. She knew I was right. She knew Trevor had been acting erratic, keeping his travel documents locked in his briefcase, making secretive phone calls in the middle of the night, and avoiding any practical discussions about moving the children overseas. He had been liquidating their shared assets and moving the cash while telling her to just pack her bags for a European dream. I watched the devastating truth wash over my sister. Trevor was not buying a villa for the family. Trevor was planning to take the stolen $12 million and flee the country alone. He was going to abandon Lauren and the children, leaving them to face the federal investigators and the massive debt he had secretly accumulated in her name. "You are lying," Lauren whispered, her voice trembling so badly it was barely audible. "Go home and check his briefcase, Lauren," I said, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "Go home and look at the life you think you have. Because by Monday morning, the fantasy is over." Lauren did not say another word. She turned around and stumbled toward the door, her expensive fake heels slipping on the carpet. She practically ran down the hallway, leaving the door wide open behind her. I stood in my office listening to her frantic footsteps fade away. I had just planted a bomb in the center of Desmond's camp, and I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Trevor was about to realize that his perfect, compliant wife was no longer blind to his crimes, and the resulting chaos was going to give me exactly the opening I needed to strike before the judge could drop his gavel on Monday morning. The courtroom remained completely still as Judge Marcus Sterling adjusted his heavy black robe and settled into the high leather chair. Desmond's expensive corporate lawyers exchanged nervous, terrified glances, their arrogant confidence visibly shaken by the sudden presence of a senior federal judge in a local probate hearing. But they had already deposited their massive retainer checks, and they had a fabricated narrative to sell to the press. The lead attorney stood up, smoothing his silk tie, and immediately launched into their opening arguments. He pulled out thick stacks of paper, waving them around as if their sheer volume made them legitimate. He claimed they were sworn medical evaluations from private physicians proving that my grandfather Elijah was suffering from severe advanced dementia during his final months. It was an absolute masterclass in legal fiction. The lawyer painted a tragic picture of a confused, vulnerable old man who was easily manipulated by a greedy, estranged granddaughter. Desmond took the stand next, moving with a slow, deliberate grace, designed to project quiet suffering. He adjusted his dark suit and looked out at the packed gallery with an expression of profound sorrow. When he spoke, his voice trembled with perfectly manufactured emotion. He told the courtroom how much it deeply pained him to be there today. He spoke about how he had tried for years to bring our broken family together, only to be consistently met with my bitter resentment and hostility. He claimed I had deliberately isolated Elijah, taking advantage of his failing mind to steal the estate away from the very people who truly loved and cared for him. Vivian dabbed her eyes in the front row, right on cue, playing her part flawlessly. The reporters in the gallery began to whisper among themselves, their pens scratching furiously across their notepads. Desmond was giving them the exact tragic narrative they wanted. A powerful, devoted father betrayed by a vindictive, unstable daughter. The gallery began to murmur against me, hostile whispers filling the spaces between Desmond's heavy sighs. I could feel the collective weight of their judgment pressing down on my shoulders, but I refused to let it break me. Judge Sterling listened to the entire performance with an unreadable expression. He rested his chin on his folded hands, his piercing eyes studying Desmond intensely. He did not interrupt. He did not object. He simply let my father dig his own grave with every fabricated word. When the defense finally rested their opening statements, the judge turned his full attention to me. The weight of his gaze was heavy, but I did not flinch. He asked if I had any medical experts to call to the stand. He asked if I had legal counsel waiting to present a defense, or if I was simply prepared to accept the ruling of the court and surrender the estate. I stood up from my empty table. I did not have a team of expensive lawyers shuffling through briefcases. I did not have paid medical experts willing to lie under oath for a piece of the payout. I picked up the thick, dark red folder from my desk, feeling the cool, smooth surface of the cover beneath my fingertips. I told Judge Sterling that I had no medical witnesses to call because my grandfather was in perfect mental health until the very day he died. I walked slowly across the center of the courtroom, the absolute silence amplifying the sharp sound of my footsteps against the polished wood floor. I thought about Elijah and the years he spent living in fear of his own son. I approached the high wooden bench and held out the red file. I told the judge that everything the court needed to understand about this entire case was sealed inside this folder. I asked him to please accept it into evidence and to specifically turn to page 42. Judge Sterling reached down and accepted the file. The entire courtroom held its collective breath as he opened the heavy red cover. He pushed his silver wire-rimmed glasses further up the bridge of his nose and flipped past the initial financial summaries and the offshore banking trails. The quiet rustle of turning pages echoed in the tense air. He found page 42. It was the master ledger, the exact document detailing the missing city funds perfectly cross-referenced with Elijah S.'s private extortion logs. I watched the judge's calm, neutral expression shift. A deep, heavy frown formed line by line across his forehead. His eyes scanned the printed numbers darting back and forth across the page, before freezing completely. He stopped moving. He stopped turning pages. The silence in the room became so thick and electric, it felt like the air itself might spontaneously combust. Judge Sterling slowly lowered the red file, resting it flat against the bench. He looked up and locked his piercing gaze directly onto my father, who was still sitting in the witness stand. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. Councilman Desmond the judge began, his voice rumbling with absolute authority. You are standing in this courtroom attempting to sue your daughter for $12 million. You claim it is to protect your family legacy and honor a sick man. But looking at these financial documents, it appears you need exactly that amount to cover a $12.4 million deficit that you embezzled from the City Social Housing Development Fund. Is that correct? Desmond turned to absolute stone. The color completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow gray shell of the powerful politician he pretended to be. His mouth opened slightly, but his usual silver-tongued charm completely failed him. A collective, massive gasp ripped through the packed gallery. The press pool erupted into total chaos, reporters shouting questions, climbing over the wooden benches, and frantically typing on their phones to break the story of the decade. The polished, untouchable image Desmond had spent decades building shattered into a million jagged pieces in a matter of seconds. Vivian dropped her silk handkerchief, staring up at her husband in genuine, unfiltered horror. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel repeatedly, demanding order in the court, but the frenzy had already taken over the room. Desmond was ruined, his political career, and his freedom instantly incinerated. But I was not entirely finished. I turned slowly away from the witness stand and locked eyes with Trevor, who was sitting frozen at the plaintiff table. His smug, arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by the wide, terrified stare of a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped shut. Lauren sat next to him, clutching her fake designer bag, looking absolutely sick to her stomach, because she already knew what was coming next. I looked back up at Judge Sterling, raising my voice to cut through the deafening noise of the panicked courtroom. "And the most interesting part of that missing money, Your Honor," I said, pointing directly at my brother-in-law across the aisle, "is that those stolen funds are no longer in my father's accounts." I stood tall in the center of the courtroom, keeping my eyes locked on Trevor. His expensive facade was melting away, revealing the desperate coward hiding underneath. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a large presentation board. I had spent hours the previous night printing a massive flow of funds chart. I lifted the heavy board and placed it on the wooden easel facing the judge and the crowded gallery. The chart was a spiderweb of financial transactions, but the thick red lines clearly highlighted a single irrefutable path. I addressed Judge Sterling, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. I told him to trace the $12.4 million as it left the City Social Housing Development Fund. Desmond had authorized the massive transfer, thinking it was going to a legitimate urban renewal contractor to cover up his own missing campaign money. But the contractor was a fake shell company created by the wealth management firm Desmond trusted blindly. I pointed to the center of the chart where the stolen money entered Trevor's firm. From there, it was shattered into dozens of smaller, untraceable transactions. It moved through a complex labyrinth of fake consulting fees, ghost payrolls, and offshore holding accounts. I told the court that every single one of those offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands was registered under one singular identity. The money was not sitting in Desmond's political war chest, waiting to save him. The money belonged entirely to Trevor Hayes. The entire courtroom inhaled a collective sharp breath. I watched Desmond slowly turn his head to look at his golden boy. The powerful, corrupt politician had spent a decade manipulating my grandfather and terrorizing our family, but he had been completely blinded by his own towering ego. He had trusted Trevor to manage his stolen wealth, and Trevor had robbed him blind right under his nose. Desmond's face twisted into a mask of absolute lethal fury. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was going down for the embezzlement of city funds, while his son-in-law was quietly planning to vanish with the cash. He lunged across the plaintiff table, grabbing Trevor by the lapels of his expensive tailored suit. Desmond snarled, letting out a guttural sound of pure violent rage, but the heavy wooden table separated them just enough to keep him from wrapping his hands around Trevor's throat. But the true explosion did not come from Desmond. It came from the woman sitting right next to Trevor. Lauren stood up so fast, her heavy wooden chair crashed backward onto the polished floor. Her pristine white pantsuit suddenly looked like a tragic costume. She stared at the financial chart, and then stared at the man she had married. All the puzzle pieces I had given her in my office suddenly snapped together in her mind. The counterfeit designer bags, the secretly refinanced mortgage on their home, the passport Trevor kept locked in his briefcase without ever securing travel visas for her or their children. She realized the horrifying truth. Trevor was never taking her to a historic villa in Tuscany. He had drained their marital assets to the absolute bone, and he was planning to flee the country with $12 million, leaving her and the children behind to face the federal investigators and a massive mountain of debt. A scream ripped through Lauren's throat. It was not a delicate cry, but a raw, animalistic shriek of pure agony and absolute humiliation. She threw herself at Trevor, swinging her arms wildly. She slapped him across the face with a sickeningly loud crack that echoed over the chaotic murmurs of the press gallery. "You lying, parasitic coward," she screamed, clawing at his chest and tearing his silk tie. "You were going to leave us. You destroyed my life, and you were going to leave us to rot while you ran away with the money." Trevor shoved his hysterical wife backward hard enough that she stumbled into Desmond. The courtroom was an absolute pandemonium. The bailiff was shouting for order, but the press pool was already swarming forward, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. Trevor knew his entire fraudulent life was over. The senior federal judge had the red file. The offshore money trail was public. His angry wife and his furious father-in-law were closing in on him, ready to tear him apart. He did the only thing a coward could do. He turned away from the plaintiff table and bolted down the center aisle. He shoved past a row of stunned reporters, kicking a heavy camera tripod out of his way as he sprinted toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the gallery. He did not make it. Before Trevor could even reach the brass handles, the heavy oak doors swung open with massive, forceful speed. A team of 6 men and women wearing dark tactical jackets flooded into the courtroom. The bold yellow letters spelling FBI across their chests stood out like a beacon of justice in the dim, chaotic room. Trevor slammed right into the lead federal agent, bouncing off the man's solid frame and stumbling backward onto the carpet. The agent did not hesitate for a single second. He grabbed Trevor by the shoulder, spun him around and slammed him face first against the heavy wooden door. I watched as the cold steel handcuffs snapped onto Trevor's wrists with a sharp metallic clicking sound. The lead agent announced in a booming voice that Trevor Hayes was under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and international money laundering. 2 other agents marched directly down the center aisle, completely ignoring the screaming reporters and the flashing cameras. They walked straight up to the plaintiff table where Desmond was still staring in absolute frozen shock. The agents grabbed my father by his arms, twisting them forcefully behind his back. Handcuffs snapped onto the powerful politician's wrists, binding him just like the common criminal he truly was. Desmond was formally informed he was under federal arrest for public corruption, extortion, and conspiracy to defraud the city. Vivian wailed from the front row, collapsing into a fit of dramatic tears, while Lauren sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. The expensive corporate lawyers were backing away from the table, holding their hands up to distance themselves from their radioactive clients. I stood at my solitary defense table, resting my hands on the smooth wood. The corrupt empire my father had built on the back of my grandfather. Suffering was burning to the ground right in front of my eyes. The courtroom was deafening with the sounds of shouting journalists, crying family members, and stern federal agents securing their prisoners. But for the first time in my entire life, I felt nothing but absolute total peace. The truth was finally out, and Elijah's legacy was safe. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4B slammed shut behind the federal agents as they marched their prisoners down the wide marble hallway. I slowly packed my red file back into my leather briefcase, moving with deliberate calm while the entire room continued to collapse around me. The expensive corporate lawyers were frantically shoving documents into their bags, practically running toward the side exits to avoid the media bloodbath that was waiting outside. I walked out of the courtroom and followed the path of the destruction toward the main entrance. The echo of heavy boots and panicked shouting bounced off the vaulted ceilings of the courthouse. When I pushed through the main revolving doors, the cold morning air hit my face again. But this time it felt entirely different. It felt like breathing for the very first time. The wide stone steps leading down to the street were completely overrun by a massive ocean of journalists, political bloggers, and local news crews. The moment Desmond and Trevor emerged from the building, the crowd erupted into an absolute frenzy of flashing cameras and shouting voices. The federal agents had to physically shove their way through the aggressive mob just to reach the fleet of black SUVs waiting at the curb with their engines running. I stood at the top of the steps leaning against a stone pillar and watched the councilman take his final public walk. Desmond kept his head down, his silver hair disheveled and his shoulders hunched in a posture of absolute staggering defeat. The heavy steel handcuffs binding his wrists gleamed under the relentless assault of camera flashes. Reporters were screaming questions at him, demanding answers about the stolen $12 million, asking if he had anything to say to the taxpayers he had betrayed for decades. He did not say a single word. He was shoved into the back of a federal vehicle looking like a broken, pathetic old man who had finally been stripped of his powerful illusions. Trevor was loaded into a separate car, violently resisting the agents and screaming that he had been set up, but his panicked protests were completely drowned out by the roar of the angry crowd. Lauren stumbled out of the courthouse a few moments later, her fake designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest as if it could somehow protect her from reality. She looked entirely hollowed out, her perfect makeup smeared with heavy dark tears of genuine terror. When the cameras turned their ruthless lenses toward her, she let out a pathetic whimper and hid her face behind her hands, fleeing down the side street to escape the public humiliation. She was going back to a massive house that belonged to the bank and a life completely suffocated by the crushing weight of federal debt. But it was Vivian who provided the final desperate act of this tragedy. The polished, untouchable matriarch of the family emerged from the heavy glass doors, looking completely unhinged. Her expensive silk scarf was askew, and her eyes were wide with a frantic, terrifying realization. She saw the federal vehicles pulling away from the curb and realized her entire world of country club luncheons, luxury vacations, and manufactured prestige was vanishing down the street forever. Then she turned her head and saw me standing quietly by the stone pillar, holding my briefcase. The desperation that flooded into her eyes was so raw and pathetic, it almost looked like genuine human emotion. Vivian rushed across the wide concrete landing, pushing aggressively past a group of lingering reporters. She practically threw herself at me, reaching out with trembling hands to grab the sleeve of my black tailored suit. Her perfectly manicured fingers dug into the dark fabric like sharp little claws, desperate for a lifeline. "Carmen," she sobbed, her voice cracking with a loud, hysterical panic. "Carmen, you have to do something. You have to save your father. You have to save our family before it is too late." She pulled at my arm, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive foundation and leaving dark tracks down her cheeks. "You have the $12 million, she cried, her voice rising into a frantic shriek. "You can pay the city back right now. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the state. Please, Carmen, we are your family. We are all you have left in this entire world. You cannot just stand there and let them destroy us like this. We need that money, Carmen. We need you." I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life treating me like a disease. I looked at the hands that had never once reached out to comfort me when I was a crying, lonely child. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel sadness or resentment, or even a single drop of pity. I just felt an overwhelming sense of profound, peaceful emptiness when I looked at her. I reached over and calmly peeled her trembling fingers off my jacket, letting her hand drop uselessly back to her side. I looked directly into her terrified eyes, making sure she saw the absolute finality staring back at her. "You left me on a freezing porch at 8 months old because I had no use to you," I said, my voice cutting through the crisp morning air like a blade of solid ice. "You spent 30 years trying to erase my existence because I did not fit into your perfect, fraudulent narrative. You allowed Desmond to terrorize my grandfather, and you sat back and happily watched while Trevor tried to steal my only inheritance. You do not care about me, Vivian. You only care about the money because without it, you are absolutely nothing." I took a slow, deliberate step backward, putting a permanent physical distance between us. "Now you have no use to me," I told her, keeping my expression completely blank and emotionless. "Goodbye, Vivian." She stood frozen on the cold concrete landing, her mouth opening and closing silently as she tried to process the absolute irreversible ruin of her life. I turned my back on her without waiting for a response. I walked down the wide stone steps, moving effortlessly through the remaining crowd of reporters who parted to let me through. A sleek black car was idling at the edge of the curb waiting for me. I opened the heavy door and slid into the quiet leather interior, placing my briefcase gently on the seat beside me. As the car pulled away from the courthouse, I looked out the tinted window one last time. I watched Vivian collapse onto her knees on the cold stone stairs entirely alone, surrounded by the flashing cameras that were eager to document her spectacular and permanent downfall. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for my entire life was finally gone. I leaned back against the comfortable leather seat and watched the city streets roll by, knowing that for the first time in 30 years, I was completely and entirely free. The seasons changed, and the news cycle chewed through the remains of my family with absolute ruthless efficiency. Months passed in a blur of federal hearings and frozen bank accounts. I watched the final verdicts from the quiet comfort of my living room, staring at the television screen as the news anchors delivered the ultimate unchangeable truth. The gavel had finally fallen. The gavel had finally and completely fallen. Desmond, the untouchable councilman, the man who thought he could buy the world, was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for public corruption and extortion. 15 years in a concrete cell where his silver hair and political charm meant absolutely nothing. Trevor received 20 years for federal wire fraud and international money laundering. 20 years behind bars for a man who used to complain about the thread count of hotel sheets. Their designer suits were replaced by standard-issue jumpsuits. Their luxury vehicles were replaced by transport buses. The empire of lies was gone. It was completely and entirely gone. The collateral damage hit the rest of the family with poetic, brutal precision. The federal government seized everything that had been purchased with stolen funds. Lauren lost the massive, sprawling estate she had treated like a royal palace. The luxury cars were towed away, the fake designer bags were auctioned off for pennies, and the bank foreclosed on the life she had built on my grandfather's suffering. She was forced to pack her remaining clothes into garbage bags and move into a cramped, damp unit in a rundown apartment complex. It was the exact same crumbling building that Trevor had tried to illegally evict me from just 1 year ago. The exact same building. The karma was so precise it almost felt orchestrated. Vivian suffered a fate that was arguably worse for a woman obsessed with status. She was completely shunned by the high society circle she had ruled for decades. The country club revoked her membership. Her wealthy friends stopped answering her phone calls and crossed the street when they saw her walking down the sidewalk. She was left to wander the city completely alone, stripped of her wealth, stripped of her prestige, and stripped of the only identity she had ever known. While they drowned in the consequences of their own greed, I walked back into the pristine offices of the legal firm to finalize my grandfather's true intentions. I sat at the heavy mahogany table and signed my name on the deeds to his commercial properties. One by one, the buildings were returned to their rightful owner. I signed for the downtown offices. I signed for the suburban retail spaces. I signed for the massive industrial warehouses. The heavy crushing weight of the litigation was finally over, and the estate was completely under my control. A full year passed before I stood in front of the largest warehouse my grandfather had ever purchased. The rusted metal doors and broken windows were gone. The crumbling brick facade had been completely restored and power washed until it looked brand new. I looked up at the massive bright sign hanging above the main entrance. It read, "The Elijah Startup Center." I had taken the abandoned property they all called worthless and transformed it into a fully funded educational hub. The center provided free financial literacy courses and forensic accounting training to underprivileged Black youth in the city. It was a place where kids who came from nothing could learn how to build wealth, protect their assets, and ensure that nobody could ever steal their future. I walked through the bustling hallways of the center, listening to the sounds of eager students and passionate teachers. I stopped in the main lobby and stood quietly in front of a large painted portrait of my grandfather, Elijah. His kind eyes looked down at me from the canvas, capturing the exact expression he used to wear when he told me I had a gift for numbers. I looked at his face and felt a profound, deep well of true peace. I had protected his legacy. I had protected his life's work, not through bitter hatred, but through relentless truth and the hard-earned skills he had taught me. The doors behind me opened, and a local news reporter walked into the lobby with a microphone. She had been following the story since the federal arrests and wanted to do a follow-up piece on the grand opening of the center. She looked at me standing in the bright, clean space and asked if I had any regrets about how everything ended. She asked me, "Carmen, do you regret destroying your family?" I turned to face her, looking directly into the camera lens with a faint, calm smile. "I did not destroy my family," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the pristine lobby. "I just removed the thieves who stole from it, starting 30 years ago. True power does not come from stolen wealth or manufactured prestige, but from an unwavering commitment to the truth." The story reveals that building an empire on the suffering of others is a fragile illusion destined to collapse. Toxic family members will use manipulation and deceit to diminish your worth to maintain their own control. You must have the courage to walk away from their lies and protect your own peace. Reclaiming your legacy requires confronting the painful reality of betrayal head-on. Ultimately, justice is not just about punishing the guilty, but about building a foundation of undeniable integrity. Share your own journey of reclaiming your power in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories of ultimate justice.